Hello and welcome. I'm Leigh-Ann Gerrans and you're watching W News, broadcasting live from the Al Arabiya studios. These are our top stories. Netanyahu says he plans to complete a new Gaza offensive fairly quickly as at least 5 people die in Israeli airstrikes. Meanwhile, deadly drones have killed 3 in Russia as Trump prepares for a so-called feel-out meeting with Putin on Friday. Ukraine's role remains uncertain. And Trump deploys the National Guard to Washington, D.C. as he cracks down on crime and homelessness in the capital. Now, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has said he plans to complete a new Gaza offensive fairly quickly, speaking after his security meeting, who approved the plans to take control of Gaza City. Netanyahu said he had no choice but to complete the job. Palestinians have reported the heaviest bombardment in weeks on Monday in areas east of Gaza City. At least 5 people were killed in the area after an Israeli airstrike. Here's what Netanyahu had to say regarding Israel's upcoming plans.
Given Hamas's refusal to lay down its arms, Israel has no choice but to finish the job and complete the defeat of Hamas. Israel's Security Cabinet instructed the IDF to dismantle the 2 remaining Hamas strongholds in Gaza City and the central camps. Contrary to false claims, this is the best way to end the war and the best way to end it speedily. I don't want to prolong the war, I want to end the war. And I think the other suggestions would have prolonged it.
Netanyahu's comments come as 5 Al Jazeera journalists were killed in an Israeli strike in Gaza City. Their funerals did take place earlier today. Israeli military have confirmed it targeted 28-year-old correspondent Anas al-Sharif. Israel believed al-Sharif served as the head of a terror cell in Hamas. Al Jazeera have called it a targeted assassination and a premeditated attack on press freedom. We can now go live to Tel Aviv to speak to our correspondent, Blake Sifton. Blake, thank you so much for joining us. First of all, what were the main takeaways from Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's press conference, which he said was intended to puncture through the lies?
Good evening, Leigh-Ann. Prime Minister Netanyahu used his press conference to repeat his now common message that there is no starvation in Gaza and that the images the world is seeing of starving children and others suffering is Hamas propaganda. However, the most important and striking message that came out of that press conference is that this planned Israeli offensive goes far beyond what was originally told to the world on Friday. The Security Cabinet had said that they had approved the Israeli military to take, seize and occupy Gaza City. That was an important enough development because there are 800,000 Palestinian civilians living there. However, in his press conference, Netanyahu clarified that the Israeli military, according to him, is going to go much wider. They're going to go into central Gaza, city of Deir al-Balah, as well as El Mawasi in the south. Now, that would mean that all territory that the Israeli military does not currently control, some 25% of Gaza, according to this plan, would fall into Israeli hands. And crucially, that's where 2 million Palestinian civilians are sheltering, of course, amid the ongoing starvation crisis. Now, some have suggested that this is just Netanyahu articulating what was always the plan. However, since Friday, when we heard plans to occupy Gaza City, there has been outrage from among his far-right coalition members who think this plan doesn't go far enough. Several of them had threatened to quit the government, possibly losing his majority in the Knesset, because they also think that perhaps this is all a ploy, that he's not serious, and that this is just a strategy to get Hamas back to the negotiating table. Because, of course, his far-right coalition members, they want the full displacement of the Palestinian population, they want the reoccupation of Gaza, and they want the resettlement of Gaza. So some are seeing this new messaging from Netanyahu that this will be a wider campaign than previously mentioned as an attempt to calm their fears.
And Blake, the UN Security Council also held an emergency meeting yesterday on Israel's plan to occupy Gaza. What was the overriding message from their gathering yesterday?
The overriding message from that Emergency Security Council meeting was one of opposition and outrage. The countries gathered said that if this goes forward, it would violate humanitarian law. We heard from China, who called it collective punishment. Russia said it would be reckless intensification of hostilities. And the UN Assistant Secretary General said that this could trigger another calamity in Gaza. We've heard over and over again for the last several weeks, if not longer, that much of the world wants this war to end. They don't want it to expand. They don't want it to widen, and they don't want it to deepen or be prolonged. And that's what this new plan that Netanyahu is advocating for looks set to do.
And the Australian government said it would recognise a Palestinian state in September. Of course, that's next month, following in the footsteps of the UK, France and Canada. Why has the Prime Minister, Anthony Albanese, made this decision now, and what has he said about it?
I think this is just further evidence of deepening opposition to this war, further pressure piling on Israel over their conduct in the war, over the starvation crisis in Gaza. We've seen public opinion shifting in Australia in recent weeks, a massive protest held in Sydney in the last few weeks. Now, Australia has also criticized this plan to, at the time, on Friday it was announced, to occupy Gaza City. They warned Israel not to go down this road. Now, in announcing plans to recognize a Palestinian state at the UN General Assembly in September, Prime Minister Albanese called the situation in Gaza a humanitarian catastrophe, and he said the situation there has gone beyond the world's worst fears. So it does seem that this has reached a breaking point for the Australian government. They are now joining Canada, the UK, and France among countries who have said that they will recognize a Palestinian state at the UN General Assembly in September. And we also understand that New Zealand and Portugal are considering following suit and also recognizing a Palestinian state.
Blake Sifton in Tel Aviv, thank you for your insights and analysis. We can now discuss this further with Fadi Hilani, Senior Fellow at the National Council on US-Arab Relations. Fadi, a pleasure to have you on the show. So we just heard from our correspondent there in Tel Aviv. Israel's president is calling Australia's plan to recognise a Palestinian state a dangerous mistake. Are countries elevating Hamas with this decision to recognise a Palestinian state?
Good evening, Leigh-Ann, and thank you very much for having me. Of course, from a U.S. perspective, yes, they are. The U.S., while it continues to support and continues its efforts to end the war in Gaza and release the hostages, however, its stance remains very much firm that any recognition of a Palestinian state at this time is very much an elevation of Hamas. There are many question marks, actually, from Washington about like the particulars and the specifics of this kind of recognition. So many in Congress are asking, what is going to be the educational system, for example, in this state? What is the army going to look like? The doctrine of this army. So very much there are many question marks on this state, as far as, like, as I said, the system, the ruling government, and we have to remember always that Washington does not trust fully the Palestinian Authority. And in fact, there have been many statements coming from the administration, which could be understood that the Palestinian Authority doesn't represent very much a partner, neither to the Israelis nor to the Americans, to perceive and to continue peace in Gaza. And we have seen that throughout the last month, the U.S. administration, Witkoff, has been working very much closely with the Qataris, with the Egyptians, but not with the Palestinian Authority. So there is very much an understanding in Washington that it's not completely against the Palestinian state per se, but it's against actually the timing, if you will, and the time when the efforts from a Washington perspective have to be focusing on the end of the war in Gaza and releasing the hostages, not very much to reward in Washington terms the Hamas movement by giving them a state. Of course, the two-state solution has not been taken off the table formally from Washington. But as I mentioned, it has to do with the timing, with the specifics, and the definition of the border of the state, the army of the state, the educational system, and so on.
So, Fadi, I hear exactly what you're saying, but if we listen to Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, he wants to go into Israel, carry out the offensive, go into Gaza, carry out the offensive and leave. He doesn't want to govern the Palestinian state or Gaza. He said this before. And also, they don't trust the Palestinian Authority. They want Hamas to disarm. They want to dismantle them. So what is the US and Israel's future plan for Gaza? Do they have any idea what it will look like after this offensive? What will happen to those people? There doesn't appear to be anything clear that we know that will come in the future.
That's the million-dollar question, Leigh-Ann, if you will, for the situation in Gaza. Now, to put it very clearly, unfortunately, there are no clear U.S. plans for the situation in Gaza and how to end the war. What the U.S. sees is imperative at the time is to dismantle Hamas. All the starvation you can see and everything happening in Gaza, unfortunately, is, from a U.S. perspective, the fault of Hamas. We have seen throughout the last month and since Donald Trump has taken power in the White House, there has been no clear pressure, unfortunately, on the Israeli government to stop the killing in Gaza and to actually stop the starvation, if you will. So very much, if we want to put it in very simple, clear terms, the U.S. in the last few months has been cleaning up the mess Benjamin Netanyahu has been leaving behind, whether, if you will, in Iran, whether now in Gaza. So what's happening now? And to many people, there is an understanding that the U.S., while it's putting a lot of effort to speak with the Qataris, with the Egyptians, to try to reach a peace deal in Gaza, there is also some pressure on Hamas spoken by the Israeli government as, you know, the plans to take over Gaza. And to many people, this could be a kind of a pressure to gain more on the negotiation table. In other words, the siege of Gaza could never happen if the U.S. was successful to end the war in Gaza. So to come back to my earlier point, there are two pillars, if you want, to the U.S. approach to Gaza. Number one, the end of the war and the end of the hostilities, killing from, you know, the Gaza people. And number two, the release of the hostages. Now, Washington understands that if it was successful in ending that war and getting an understanding that Hamas is dismantled, there is no need in the first place, of course, to take over Gaza. So that is the U.S. perspective. And if the takeover of Gaza happens, that is because there was no peace deal reached, and that is because Hamas is not flexible on the negotiation table. So when it comes to the end of the day, there is always a blame from the U.S. administration to Hamas because, number one, it started the war in the first place with this October 7 operation from an American understanding, and number two, it's not showing enough flexibility on the negotiation table so that the war will end. So it comes at the end of the day, as I mentioned, to be Hamas to blame and not the Israelis, unfortunately. Now, if you look at the military operations happening in Gaza so far, the U.S. understand that this is a very bad situation. It has to end. But again, when it comes to exerting pressure on the Israelis, we don't have any kind of pressure from the U.S. on the Israelis. And
But Fadi, I'm sorry, I just want to quickly interject there if I can, because we are slightly running out of time. And I just want to ask you about the Arab nations. They've heavily criticized Israel's new plan to take control of much of Gaza. Are Arab nations putting enough pressure on the US to stop Israel's actions? Because you just talked to me there about pressure to stop things happening. What are the Arab nations doing?
The Qataris and the Egyptians are, in fact, trying to speak to the Americans about the necessity and the importance of ending the situation in Gaza. And there is an understanding, if the U.S. Was putting some pressure on the Israelis, this could not have happened possibly in the way we are seeing it nowadays, whether when it comes to the number of people killed every day, even including journalists. As you know, this morning, Al Jazeera journalist was killed, or even the starvation, which is happening, of course, in Gaza. So the Arab stance, and especially the Qataris, the Jordanians, and the Egyptians, is very clear on this. This, what they call genocide, has to stop. The starvation has to end. But the Israelis, understandably, if there is no U.S. pressure, no matter how pressure they are getting, whether from the Europeans who are saying they want to recognize the Palestinian state, whether it's from the Arab states, that's not going to happen. The U.S. silence on what's happening in Gaza is understood as an unwritten green light to the Israelis to continue what they are doing. And if what happens in the following on Saturday, as we know, Steve Witkoff is meeting the Qatari Prime Minister to try to reach a deal. So if this deal is managed by having some, let's say, concessions from Hamas, some concessions from the Israelis, we hopefully are not going to see a takeover of Gaza by the Israelis. But if, God forbid, there is no peace deal reached, I think, and the Israelis go further with their plan, the Americans are not going to overtly greenlight this, but they are going actually to blame Hamas for the escalation and for the killing, and we will be back to square one.
Fadi Hilani, Senior Fellow at the National Council on US-Arab Relations. Thank you for your analysis and insights on that story for us. Now, 3 people have been killed in Russia in overnight Ukrainian drone attacks, with 59 drones intercepted. 7 of them were en route to Moscow. The strikes come as attention turns to a high-stakes meeting between Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin this Friday in Alaska. European leaders are urging that Ukraine not be sidelined from the talks, with Zelensky insisting Kyiv must be part of any peace negotiations. Writing on Telegram, the Ukrainian president said Russia is dragging out the war and therefore deserves stronger pressure from the world. Russia refuses to stop the killings and therefore should not receive any reward or positives for itself. And this is not just a moral position, it is a rational position. Concessions do not convince a killer. We can now go live to Moscow to speak to Sergei Markov, Director of the Institute of Political Studies and former public spokesperson for President Donald Trump. Sergei, thank you for joining us again. First of all, your reaction to President Zelensky there. Is Russia dragging out the war and does it refuse to stop?
Russia wants to stop war as soon as possible. You may know Zelensky many times told that Russia and Ukraine are enemies, but Vladimir Putin many times told that Russia and Ukrainians are part of the one big Russian people. And Putin, I'm 100% sure about this. I know this for sure. Putin regards this war as a civic war inside one country, which is was artificially divided. That's why Putin wants to stop this war as soon as possible. Putin demands is very simple: stop repression in Ukraine against those Ukrainians who support friendship between Russia and Ukraine. Second, stop political repression against Russian language. I should remember that this language, which is native for the 70% of Ukrainian populations. This is language prohibited in education system and media, in all official spheres. So it's political repression against Russian identity. And Vladimir Putin demands to stop such political repression. Also to stop political repression against Orthodox Church, which is a church for Ukrainian Russian people during more than 1,000 years. So if this demand finished, accepted, Russia immediately stop any military operation. But if terror continue, Russia will continue its liberation of Ukrainian Russian people from the repressive regime.
So you say the liberation of Ukrainian people. Ukraine has spent 4 years fighting back Russia's offensive in the country. So it's a very difficult situation to be. A lot of Ukraine wants their own territory. Why are they fighting you if they want to be part of Russia?
It's very easily because they have neo-Nazi regime. I should remember you, the Germans fight against American and British and Soviet Russian troops, which liberated Germany from the Nazi regime, but nevertheless, Germans fight against the liberator. But after this regime finished, all Germans say, oh, look, it was our mistake. In fact, we never support this repressive regime. Same with Ukrainians. No democracy in Ukraine. It's politically repressive neo-Nazi regime. It's exactly what Putin told you already 5 years.
But I just want to say something that I think Ukraine and Volodymyr Zelensky will deny what you've just said. And also, currently, you said something that was interesting there, because Zelensky hasn't had elections, and the reason is that because they are on a war footing. Putin hasn't had elections in Russia for ages too, so it's not very fair to say it's not a democratic country where they would be holding elections if they weren't attacked. And when did Russia last have fair elections?
You know, Russia has elections even during the war. And everybody knows that Vladimir Putin is extremely popular in Russia. He is not popular not only in Russia. Frankly speaking, if Ukraine have not such repressive terroristic elections, but free and fair elections, Vladimir Putin will win free and fair election in Ukraine as well. And I strongly believe in this. And of course, this election was falsified by Americans and by British. And the idea is very simple. Only those politicians who promise that they will be hatred with Russia, they have been allowed by American and British occupants to those elections. And if you look at the situation, you will see Ukrainians voted for the mostly not anti-Russian politician, whom Zelensky was when he ran his election campaign.
Sergei, I want to move this conversation. Okay, let's move this conversation on slightly, because I want to get back to the reason why we are talking today. Yes. And one of those reasons is we've also just heard from Donald Trump, and we know the plan is for him to, of course, meet Vladimir Putin on Friday in Alaska. We've been waiting for a really long time for this meeting to happen, months and months. What do you think and what do you believe will be achieved in this historic meeting between the two leaders on Friday? Do you think a ceasefire will be achieved? Will peace be achieved? Will Putin go with some concessions?
Concessions. Forget about concession of Putin. Russian army is going forward. Why Putin should make a concession? You're absolutely normal. You're not you, but sorry, and other people who ask this question. No concession from the army which is winning and going forward. And now about possible result of the Trump-Putin meeting. I think most probably that they will claim, first of all, air truce. So stopping of the bombing of the big cities far from the front line. It's first. Secondly, there has been agreed sectoral ceasefire on the south of the front line in Zaporozhye and Kherson region. Then they were decided that it is would be very good to have exchange of territories. Russia will give to the Ukraine those Ukrainian territory which they control in Sumy region, Kharkov region, Nikolaev region, and Dnipropetrovsk region. And Ukraine will give to Russia those territory which it can control in Donetsk region. It's an exchange of 1,500 kilometers to the 7,000 kilometers. It's look not balanced by figures, but you should take into account that Russian army is winning, Russian army is going forward, and Ukrainian army is going back. So from this point of view, this is more or less a realistic exchange of the territories. So they come to the agreement, but then European leaders and Zelensky will deny those agreements. I think will be a result.
Okay, well, it's quite interesting because Donald Trump was also talking earlier, and he said that Trump on the Putin meeting going to try to get some territory back for Ukraine. So what you've said, nothing's been set in stone because these discussions haven't happened yet. And also Donald Trump is going to tell President Putin to end the war, and he hopes to have a constructive conversation. So right now, no territory has been given away or discussed as of yet. But I have one more question to ask you. And we know Vladimir Putin is going to Alaska on Friday. Do you think he should be arrested because he's been indicted by the International Criminal Court and they want to try him for ordering the thefts of thousands of children from Ukraine?
Everybody knows that this decision of criminal court, politically corrupted decision, and it was made by leaders of criminal court with cooperation of pedophilia lobby in Europe. And the brother of the head of the criminal court was sitting in the British prison in accusation exactly for pedophilia. That's why they doesn't like that Putin saved thousands of children in Ukraine and didn't allow to move them to Europe for sexual exploitation by pedophilia lobby. It's first, it's about the fact. And about criminal court decision. United States of America does not recognize this criminal court as well as Russia.
Sergei Markov, director of the Institute of Political Studies and former public spokesman for President Putin, thank you. Let's take a look at some of the other stories making headlines today. At least one person has died after a 6.1 magnitude earthquake in Turkey. An 81-year-old woman died shortly after being pulled out from underneath the rubble at the site of the epicenter. At least 16 buildings collapsed and 29 were injured in Sunday's quake. Search and rescue operations have now concluded. South Korea's military has shrunk by 20% over the last 6 years due to the country's dismal birth rate. That's according to a Defense Ministry report. And despite maintaining compulsory military service, South Korea has a birth rate of 0.5 babies per mother. That's the world's lowest. A wildfire has broken out on an extinct volcano overlooking the Scottish capital of Edinburgh. Scottish Fire and Rescue Services are trying to put out the blaze on Arthur's Seat, but it has spread extensively. Police are advising people to avoid the popular landmark. And Elon Musk has applied for a license to supply electricity to British homes. If approved by Ofgem regulatory body, Tesla would be allowed to compete directly with the big firms that currently power homes and businesses in the UK. Tesla Electric has been operating a power supplier in Texas since 2022 that pays customers for selling excess energy back to the grid. President Trump has announced he's deploying the National Guard to Washington, D.C. as he pledges to crack down on crime in the city. That means the city's police will come under federal control. Here's what he had to add during a White House press conference, which kicked off earlier today.
I'm announcing a historic action to rescue our nation's capital from crime, bloodshed, bedlam, and squalor. Under the authorities vested in me as the President of the United States, I'm officially invoking Section 740 of the District of Columbia Home Rule Act. You know what that is? And placing the D.C. Metropolitan Police Department under direct federal control, and you'll be meeting the people that will be directly involved with that. In addition, I'm deploying the National Guard to help reestablish law, order, and public safety in Washington, D.C., and they're going to be allowed to do their job properly.
We can now go live to Washington to speak to our correspondent, Sarah Firth. Sarah, so we just heard from President Donald Trump. He was speaking at the White House earlier. It was a really lengthy speech that covered a million different things. But what stood out to you in his remarks today? And did we get any more clarity on what this plan to make Washington safer and more beautiful will actually look like? He talks about bedlam, squatters, squalors.
Yes, Leigh-Ann, President Trump announcing to that absolutely packed press conference in the White House a little bit earlier, saying we are taking our capital back. Now, he announced, as you said, the deployment of National Guard troops to D.C. and that the D.C. Metropolitan Police will be coming under federal control. Now, what does this all mean? Well, the president is saying that this is taking place to try and tackle crime, homelessness, and what he sees as a public safety emergency in Washington, D.C. When he was announcing this, he made mention, as we heard there, of the Home Rule Act of 1973. Now, for people who don't know, that is how Washington, D.C. is governed. It is not a state. And so the federal government already has certain powers here in Washington, D.C. But the Washington, D.C. has that unique status. Now, under this act, the president has invoked these powers, that under an emergency, he can do what he's done, which is taking the the Metropolitan Police Department under direct federal control. He has, though, importantly, certain parameters within that law. It's only 48 hours that he should hold those powers unless Congress approves it. And even when Congress approves it, it's thought only a 30-day limit. Now, it's not clear right now on the technicalities of how that's actually going to work, or if the president is going to get an extension beyond those 30 days. We also don't know, Leigh-Ann, how many National Guard troops are going to be deployed right now. It's a very unprecedented step. It's not normal at all to see the likes of the FBI patrolling with local police authorities, having the National Guard on the streets of Washington, D.C. This is all extremely unique. The last time we saw National Guards deployed to the streets of Washington, D.C., that was back in January of 2021 when you had the Capitol riots. I can tell you it was a very, very surreal sight seeing those armed guards around the Capitol. Well, that is going to be happening. We heard the U.S. Secretary of Defense, Pete Hegseth, also speaking at that press conference, saying those guards will be flowing into D.C. over the next week.
Yes, as you say, Sarah, unprecedented, but the mayor has actually pushed back strongly, pointing to falling crime rates in Washington, D.C., and basically accusing the White House of exaggerating the problem. How big is the gap between the data and the political rhetoric here?
There is a big gap. The president, again today, sort of doubling down on his assertion that those crime statistics were rising. He at one point held up a chart that he said seemed to reflect that Washington, D.C. had the highest crime of most cities in the world. He made a comparison again to having a worse crime rate, he alleges, than Baghdad. We've heard that allegation before. But Leigh-Ann, you're right. Look, the stats simply don't match the rhetoric. I'll just take you through some of them. Assault with a violent weapon, down by about 20%. Robberies down by about 26%. Violent crime also down 26%. So what we heard over the weekend from DC Mayor Muriel Bowser, she repeated these crime statistics that yes, there has been a spike back in 2023, but those rates are now going down. The president pushing back on that today, though. We heard him in that press conference, as I said, sort of doubling down on the fact that crime simply too high. And so he had invoked and had signed executive orders to be able to invoke these measures, whereby because of what he calls a public safety emergency, we are now going to see those National Guard troops deployed and the police under federal governance. Why is this raising alarm bells for some here in America? It's seen by many as an overreach of executive powers and of an undermining of the local authorities' ability to do their job. President Trump saying today in that press conference that the police are going to be allowed to do their job properly. At one point he said, if they spit, we hit, saying that the police will now be able to hit back if anyone spits at them. It's those kinds of parameters that now become unclear as to how the police are going to be able to act. But it is an absolutely unprecedented step that we're going to see armed guards on the streets of Washington, D.C. And the president absolutely adamant today he is going to be making D.C. beautiful and safe again.
Sarah Firth in Washington, thank you so much for joining us. Let's take a look at the top business news now. Supporters of India's Prime Minister Narendra Modi are calling for the boycott of foreign brands like McDonald's and Amazon in the country. Anti-American sentiments have been attributed to US President Donald Trump's tariffs. Even as anti-US protests simmer, Tesla launched its second showroom in New Delhi on Monday.
To the USA, including
US fashion designer Willie Chavarara has apologized after a shoe he created in collaboration with Adidas Originals were criticized for cultural appropriation. The slip-ons were inspired by traditional leather sandals made by indigenous artisans in Mexico. Mexico's Deputy Minister of Culture said Adidas had contacted officials to discuss restitution to the people who were plagiarized. Turning to all the sports news now, and Justin Rose has won the 12th PGA Tour title in a nail-biting playoff in Memphis. Rose had lost on the first hole playoff with Rory McIlroy at this year's Masters. The Englishman becomes the first player in his 40s to win a tour this season, claiming his first title since the Pebble Beach Pro-Am in February 2023. And Jen Pell has made US sporting history by becoming the first female umpire to referee a Major League Basketball game during the regular season. Pell has in the minor leagues for years and has overseen more than 1,000 games in her career. Her entry into MLB comes 28 years after the NBA allowed its first female basketball referee. A reminder of our top stories. Netanyahu says he plans to complete a new Gaza offensive fairly quickly as at least 5 people die in Israeli airstrikes. Meanwhile, deadly drones have killed 3 in Russia as Trump prepares for a so-called feel-out meeting with Putin on Friday. Ukraine's role does remain uncertain. And Trump deploys the National Guard to Washington, D.C. as he cracks down on crime and homelessness in the capital. And that's all from us on W News. Don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel and, of course, follow us on X. The Rail Deal with Tom Burgess-Watson is coming up next. Plus, we'll be back in a couple of hours with W News Extra. Goodbye and thank you.